Arturo Machuca just showed up. So Arturo, as you've heard me mention many times, sometimes derogatory, but mostly complimentary. Arturo, of course, is the director of the Houston Spaceport, who has been the sponsor of this lecture series for a number of years now, and we're very grateful for that. It helps us do certain things. I should point out that tonight's speaker has donated his little fee to the space students for this exploration and development of space. They have their big conference next month. Juan de la Garza is here. He's the RICE is hosting it, and he's the lead for that. So thank you for doing that, Chris. I appreciate that.
Pleasure.
And so before we get started, I wanted to give, since we don't get to hear from Arturo very often, I wanted to give him just a couple of minutes. Fortunately, our speaker is really good in the sense that he's giving me a very, very short bio to read, which makes it easy. But I'd like to give Arturo a couple of minutes just to give you a quick update on all the exciting things, or some of the exciting things that's happening at the spaceport. So Arturo, if you don't mind.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Hi, Chris.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
Thank you for being here. Certainly appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I wanted to just come and say hello and thank you for giving us the time to come and participate, be part of this great lecture series that Dr. David Alexander puts together. Right, I've been doing this for many years. We proud to be part of the sponsorship, right, to make this happen. But I take a minute to quickly ask a question of you. I don't know how many of you are familiar or have heard about what's going on here in the city of Houston with regards to the development of a commercial spaceport. And I would like to see those who have heard. Would you please raise your hands just to see you? Okay, so about 50-50. Well, it is happening since 2015. Houston obtained a license from the Federal Aviation Administration, Office of Commercial Space, to operate Ellington as a commercial spaceport. The vision that we have had is one that has proven successful. We have obviously, our aspirations towards hosting horizontal operations for spacecraft that will take off like planes, pretty much, right, and go out in the Gulf of Mexico and do their space flying. But most importantly, as we were planning we were working on our vision, we decided that we would first of all create a cluster of aerospace and aviation companies at the Houston Spaceport. That was the vision, right, with the intent of making sure that Houston remained relevant in the space business. And I am so happy to share with you that vision, has proven successful. Today, again, I'm sure many of you don't know, Houston, in a short period, less than 6 years, went from just a paper spaceport development, pretty much, right, to now actively, besides all the great work that Johnson Space Center does, the Houston Commercial Spaceport is now also in the process of supporting lunar activities, low Earth orbit activities. So it's just fantastic. We have announced in the past 8 months the coming of 3 large companies all together. They mean in terms of capital improvements and development of the spaceport, about 750,000 square feet, which is about, if you were to put it in dollars, just the construction is about $300 million. Pretty significant impact. And then you have the jobs that will be generated, which we estimate right now in the next 18 to 24 months to be about 1,500 jobs, right? This is just nothing but fantastic news. It is happening, and we are doing all this again with a vision of making sure that Houston, working right next to that jewel that we have at Johnson Space Center and NASA, right, continues to remain pretty relevant in what we're doing. So that's what's going on. Maybe one of these days, if you guys and Dr. David Alexander give me the chance, I'll come back and show you a little bit more of the detail of what's going on over there. But thank you again for being here. It is my pleasure, and look forward to enjoying Chris's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arturo. So we were getting some this is for the Zoom land out there, we're getting some comments about sound being choppy. Please let us know if you can hear me, and Chris, if we turned off the second mic that may have been causing some of the issues, it may have something to do with Arturo not standing in like the right spot or something. I don't know what the right spot is, but please let us know and we'll try and work it as we go. So before I introduce tonight's speaker, just our next lecture, the last one for the season, is only, I think, 3 weeks away, November 11. And it's going to be Steve Artemis, who is the CEO of Intuitive Machines. So Intuitive Machines are based at the Houston Spaceport and are likely to be the first company to put a commercial lander on the surface of the moon, hopefully in 2022. So Steve's a former director, or deputy director of Johnson Space Center. So hopefully you'll be able to make it for that too. But I really am excited about tonight. I have never met KRIS before in person, but I did attend an event that the Canadian Space Agency was hosting, in which KRIS was one of the keynote speakers. And I was just enthralled by what he had to say and the kind of story that he has to tell about his involvement, particularly with NASA and the astronaut corps. And of course, he's based here in Houston too. So, immediately, I think within a few days, I introduced myself and invited him to come and talk. So I'm sure I know you're in for a treat, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say tonight. And like I said, he's a really good guy. He gave me a very, very brief bio, so I don't have to go through a whole page full of stuff. So let me just introduce him very briefly before I let him take the stage. So Dr. KRIS Lehnhardt is the element scientist for exploration and medical capability in the Human Research Program at NASA Johnson Space Center. He's an associate professor at Baylor College of Medicine in the Center for Space Medicine and the Department of Emergency Medicine. Dr. Lehnhardt is board certified in emergency medicine in both Canada and the United States. I don't know where you have more money, but we can talk about that at some other point. And he works clinically in the emergency department at the Taub Hospital in Houston, Texas. And so I'm really excited to hear how we can keep astronauts safe and well in their trips in the future into Mars. So KRIS, please, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and I appreciate the fact that you've given up your evening to hear about space stuff. So we are kindred spirits in that respect. I would do the same. So first of all, everyone can hear me well? Yes. Folks online, can you hear me well?
Yeah, they're saying it sounds better.
Sounds good?
Second.
All right, perfect. So with that, I'll get started. And as was mentioned, I'm here today to talk to you about how we can prepare for medicine on Mars, but I used a quote in the title of this talk, and I might have given it away when I flipped through my slides before, but does anyone know where the first part of this title, the quote, comes from?
Star Trek.
Thank you, yes, it comes from Star Trek. So as a physician, I've always loved watching the medicine on Star Trek and seeing how they evolve over time. And a few years ago, Star Trek Voyager came out. I say a few years ago, it was many years ago now, unfortunately. But in that show, you had a crew in a vehicle that were completely independent from Earth. They were so far away that there was no communication, there was no resupply. They were really and truly on their own. And so it actually is a pretty good analogy in some ways for what we're gonna have to deal with when we push off into deep space. When we try to go to Mars, there are a lot of challenges that are reminiscent somewhat of what the Voyager crew had to go through. And their illustrious doctor, the actor's name is Robert Picardo, but the doctor was called the Doctor, and he was an emergency medical hologram. And so in many people's minds, this might be what the future of medicine looks like, and that is entirely possible. But I can tell you today that we are very far away from this type of future. And so we have to figure out what are the steps that we need to take to try and move in that direction. And I had the pleasure a few years ago of meeting another Star Trek doctor, Gates McFadden, when I was on a panel with her talking about how Star Trek has influenced NASA with respect to medicine in space. And so my fellow panelists, some were a previous or historical flight surgeon from missions a number of years ago. One was an astronaut who is a physician and was a space doctor on the space station. There was me talking about what the future of space medicine might look like. And then, of course, we had Dr. Crusher with us, telling us about her experience playing a physician in the future and all the fantastical things that she was able to do. And we would love to see all of that come to fruition. So the next question then, of course, has to be, how do we do that? How do we get from here to there? And obviously it's going to take many years, but we can start doing the work today to move towards that vision for the future. So here we are. This is the International Space Station. It is above us right now, 250 miles up, and there is a crew on there that has been on that station. We have had people on that station now for 20 years continuously. And we have learned a lot about how to take care of people in space during that time. We've done long duration missions, which are on average about 6 months in length. And we've sent quite a number of people up to the space station over the last 20 years. So we've learned a lot about how to take care of folks near home or near to Earth. But when we were originally planning the space station, before it was the International Space Station, it was Space Station Freedom, and it was going to be a US only space station. And during that planning, when talking to the physicians about the medical care that they were going to need for low Earth orbit, for the space station, one of the proposals was that we should have a hyperbaric chamber on the space station. Now, for those of you who don't know, we use hyperbaric chambers in medicine for people who suffer from diving illnesses related to decompression sickness. And when you do spacewalks, you can get decompression sickness in space. And so the idea was that if the astronauts got decompression sickness, we needed a way to treat them, and that way was going to be a hyperbaric chamber. Our engineering colleagues, however, asked, how big is this chamber? How much does it weigh? And when we told them how big it was and how much it weighed, they were essentially proposing an entire module just for medicine on the space station. And the engineers came back to us and said, how many times have you used a decompression chamber or a hyperbaric chamber in space before? And we said, never, we've never had one. And they said, how many people have gotten decompression sickness in space? And we said, to the best of our knowledge, no one. And they're like, you want an entire module with this enormous thing to take care of a condition that has never occurred in spaceflight. And the doctor said, yeah, but we're really worried about it. And the engineers said, sorry, but no. So there's no hyperbaric chamber on the space station. I want to tell you a different story now about this woman, Sally Ride. So when she was the first American woman to go to space, a bunch of engineers had to figure out what she needed to take with her. And they said, what if she's menstruating? What if she's on her period? We better send up some tampons. And they said, what's a reasonable number of tampons we should send up? And someone was like, how about 100? And that's what they wanted to do. The engineers wanted to send 100 tampons up for a short mission on the space shuttle for one person. So clearly, the engineers don't have all the answers from a human health and performance perspective, and the physicians don't necessarily have all the answers from an engineering and design perspective. So the question then becomes, how do we come up with the right answers together? And so a few years ago, NASA actually published a document that they called the Rosetta Stone Project, and it was all about the interdisciplinary planning that was needed for human exploration missions and for human system design. And what it meant was that we should have teams of people, engineers, scientists, and doctors working together to come up with the best designs possible for space exploration. And so ultimately, that's what we have done. The group that I work for at NASA, called XMC, or Exploration Medical Capability, we are a team of engineers, scientists, and doctors working together to advance medical system design and risk-informed decision-making for our missions beyond low Earth orbit. We've learned a lot about how to take care of people close to home. Now we have to figure out how we can take care of people when we push off into deep space. The human research program, of which the Exploration Medical Capability element is a part, thinks about the risks or the hazards of spaceflight in terms of these 5 things. And in the group that I work for, the area that we are focused on is truly the distance from Earth part of the problem. And the reason that that's important to us is because as we move further and further away from home, everything we're doing today has to fundamentally change. And so we're talking about a paradigm shift from the way that we take care of people today on the space station to the way that we're going to need to take care of people on exploration missions to the moon first, yes, but ultimately to Mars. And so when you think about the current state, we have 6-month, maybe 1-year missions for our astronauts. We send up resupply vehicles once a month, once every 2 months approximately to the space station. So you forgot something, you ran out of something, you need more of something, we can send you more. We have almost complete real-time communications with the space station. So the loss of signal that we have with space station is only a few minutes and it's only a few times a day. And during those times, when we have no signal with the space station, every flight controller and mission control gets up and runs to the bathroom. So we are constantly talking to space station, and they are constantly talking to us. We also have the ability to return samples to Earth relatively easily. So we can take blood samples, urine samples, stool samples, you name it, and we can freeze them and bring them back to Earth and analyze them. And so we can assess the health of the astronauts, but only after their mission is done, or after those samples have been returned home. The way that our medicine for the space station has been designed has been focused on treating everyday concerns, what are sometimes referred to as nuisance problems, back pain, headache, sinus congestion, that kind of stuff. But if something serious happens, the plan has always been to stabilize the person as best as you can and then get out of there. So from a medical perspective, we call that stay and play or scoop and run. The space station is designed for scoop and run. The idea is that if something bad happens, we are going to evacuate the person from the space station. And last but not least, because of that, we have fairly limited medical care on board the space station. And that is by design, because we don't need more than that because of our proximity to Earth. So our limited care on station and everything else about space station is Earth dependent or Earth reliant. But our exploration missions to Mars in particular are going to require a different way of thinking about the problem. These missions may be 2, if not 3 years in length. There's going to be no possibility of resupply. So you're 4 months on the way to Mars, you forgot something, too bad. You are on your own. There's going to be no real-time communications. We are just victims of the speed of light, and we haven't figured out how to get past that yet. So we are going to have to deal with delayed communications back and forth and trouble transmitting the amount of data and the bandwidth that we have going back and forth to vehicles to Mars. And we're going to have no ability to do sample returns. If we need to know the answer to something, we need to figure it out in space. We can't just send a sample home for analysis. As I mentioned with the resupply, the evacuations are exactly the same thing. If you are 4 months on the way to Mars and somebody gets sick and you want to bring them home, too bad. So we can't get past the orbital mechanics and the physics. If you're 4 months out, it would take you more than 4 months to get home. And so as a result, we have to increase our onboard capabilities. We have to decrease our reliance upon Earth. We need to find ways to push medicine into space. And so ultimately, we hope to do that with a series of missions before we go to Mars. The next step for NASA is to do missions to the moon. These are called the Artemis Missions, and they are sequential in terms of their complexity and their buildup. And what you see here is a piece of the Gateway spacecraft, which is going to be a small space station that orbits the moon. But ultimately, our destination is Mars, and what we are trying to do is do what we need to prepare for Mars. And so we want to, as much as possible, use the Artemis missions for that purpose. So what we want to do is we want to train and prepare for Mars missions, from a medical perspective, using the moon. It's close, relatively, and it provides us with a great training ground or proving ground for our technologies and our capabilities. And so as a result, as these Artemis missions become more complex, we envision astronauts staying longer and longer on or around the moon. And ultimately, there may actually be a plan for a mission where we try to simulate an entire Mars mission on the moon. So we send astronauts into orbit in deep space for months at a time. We send them down to the lunar surface for a few months at a time. And then we send them back up to the space station, to the Gateway space station, in orbit around the moon to simulate the transit home from Mars. And doing that will allow us to test all of our capabilities, all of our systems, and allow us to see how the human system responds to long-duration deep space exploration, which we have, as a species, never done before. So in order to imagine a world in which we have increasing crew autonomy or increasing Earth independence, we need to start thinking about the capabilities that are necessary for a medical system to deal with the conditions that we believe are going to occur, but also to help us be prepared for the things that we cannot predict. Even as few as a few years ago, a new condition occurred in spaceflight that we had never seen before and had not anticipated. And so there's a pretty good chance on the way to Mars that someone is going to end up with an illness or an injury that we were not anticipating. So in order to build this autonomy, we need to have onboard capabilities for analysis and for diagnostics. We need to have crew health systems that are actually integrated with the vehicle and optimize all of the vehicle resources. So this is simple things like oxygen or fluid or suction, which we use for a number of different medical conditions. We need to predict everything we need before we go and put it all in the spacecraft so it's there when we need it. I work in the emergency department. Things come in every day that I was not anticipating. I have no idea at the beginning of any shift, everyone that's going to come through the door, what all of their problems are going to be, and all of the stuff I'm going to need to take care of them. But that is what we are asking NASA to do for a Mars mission. You have to be prepared for anything that could occur, but also have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen before you go so you can plan accordingly. And then lastly, we need our folks on board to have all of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they need at their disposal to take care of themselves. They can't rely on coming home. They can't rely on phoning a friend necessarily. There's going to be a number of situations in which they have to respond immediately, and they have to know what to do or be able to figure it out on their own. So from a paradigm perspective, this progressive Earth independence is fundamentally different from what we do on space station. And so it requires in situ analysis. It requires enhanced medical procedure support. It requires advanced computing tools, maybe not an emergency medical hologram, but there are technologies that we can use and give to our astronauts to help them take care of themselves. And then we have to find every possible way to be as efficient about the use of every resource on board. Nothing can be wasted because anything might be needed at a later time. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through some of the different technologies and capabilities that our group, XMC, has been looking into for this purpose. And so we're going to start with in situ analysis, both from a laboratory perspective and from a pharmaceutical perspective. So it's too bad that Kate couldn't make it because Kate was instrumental in us testing this device on the space station. So what we have here is a white blood cell analyzer. And this device can, within approximately 5 minutes, tell you a white blood cell count and a differential, which are the types of cells that are in those white blood cell counts. And this is a capability that we use every day on most, if not all, patients that we see in the emergency department. This is a standard medical laboratory procedure. And it has now been shrunk down into a device that can do it in a very small space very quickly. So it is point of care testing. So we wanted to see if this device was going to work in the space environment. So we took an off-the-shelf device. We made some very small modifications to it to try and make sure it was going to work. We designed a procedure to do it, and we sent it up to the space station. And we sent it up with a series of control solutions so that when you tested it, you knew what the answer should be, and you can see if it's giving you the right answer. And then we tested it, and it totally didn't work. If you had put this on a mission to Mars and had not done this testing, you would have been partway into your mission, needing this thing, going to use it, and finding that it didn't work. Now, the good news is, it didn't work because of us, not because of the device. We had not created our procedure properly. So we got a bunch of feedback from the astronauts on board, we changed our procedures, and we ran it again, and this time it worked. So the demonstration of this technology is not just, does the thing work, but can the people use it for what is it intended to do? Because if they can't, it's basically a brick, and you just flew a brick to space that is not useful to anybody. So the important thing in this technology demonstration was not only to show that we can have this kind of in situ lab capability in spaceflight, but that people can use it, and hopefully can use it to make good medical decisions. Another device that we're hoping to test soon on space station is a more advanced or more complex laboratory analysis device. And this is an interesting one because this is one that has been designed from the beginning with spaceflight in mind. And so NASA has been working with a company to develop this technology. And they are developing it, the company is, primarily for Earth use. But all along the way, we've been giving them what we believe we would want it to do if it flew in space, and the types of requirements we would want it to have if it flew in space. And they have been building that into the design of this technology. And so this is an integrated blood analyzer and a vital signs monitor. So the idea is, how can I shrink technology? How can I make things multifunctional? How can I reduce the footprint for the stuff that I need while also increasing my capability? And so our hope is when we're able to fly this device, that we're going to be able to show that you can actually do a lot more in situ analysis in space than we've ever done in the past. And these types of technologies are then candidates to be included in a future medical system that goes to Mars. The last one has to do with a specific risk that we have at NASA, which is related to pharmaceuticals, and that is maintaining a safe and effective pharmacy for exploration missions. Every medicine you buy on the ground comes with an expiration date, and generally that expiration date is shorter than a mission to Mars. So the question then becomes, are those medicines going to be safe for 2, if not 3 years to go to Mars? If we have to pre-deploy things either to the Mars orbit or to the Mars surface for people to use, they need to last for 5 years, maybe longer, depending upon when we send those early missions and we pre-deploy things. So one device that we've looked at is essentially a shrunk down form of a Raman spectrometer, and it would be able to be used real time to assess medication for its effectiveness. So you'd be able to have a headache, go to the medical system, pull Tylenol from the medical system, pop it in the machine says, yep, take it, or nope, don't take it, and then you switch to a different medicine or you try a different pill. And so the idea would be that you have real-time analysis of your medication to know if it's going to be safe and effective for your needs. All right, so those are a few of the examples of what we're doing with respect to in situ or in-place analysis that we can do in space on spacecraft. But the other thing we need to do is we need to be able to help the astronauts to do complex medical tasks. Not every astronaut is a doctor, much to my chagrin. And when we send people to the space station, we often don't send a doctor at all. And so for an exploration mission, the question then becomes, if we're not sending a doctor, if we're not sending a medically trained person, can we help them to do a procedure that is complex and difficult from a medical perspective without having to talk to the ground? And so for this, we developed a software package that we call AMOS, or the Autonomous Medical Officer Support Software. And the idea behind AMOS is that we can create procedure guidance for the astronauts to help them do complex medical tasks without talking to the ground. What you see in this picture are two astronauts doing a kidney and bladder ultrasound. And right now on Space Station, we can do this kind of ultrasound, but if we do it, they are going to be talking to someone on the ground every second while they're doing that procedure. And the person on the ground is going to be giving them real, live, remote guidance. So for a Mars mission where we don't have that kind of communication capability, we need to be able to build that into the software. Can we help the software or build the software to guide the astronauts through the procedure? So what we did is we built this software package. We sent it up to Space Station. We didn't let the astronauts see it on the ground. We didn't let them see it in advance before they were going to use it, much more than a couple of days. The day before, they got an opportunity to flip through it and see how it worked and get familiar with it. And then the next day, we gave them the software package, we handed them an ultrasound, we turned off the communication with the ground, and we said, have at it, see how you do. And I'm very pleased to tell you that astronauts are pretty smart. They figured it out really quickly, and they were able to successfully capture really good pictures of the kidney and the bladder that could be sent to the ground for interpretation. It's easy to transmit video or data or images to the ground as data for someone on the ground to look at, but it's much harder for someone on the ground to be telling them, turn your probe 30 degrees and then waiting 10 minutes for the next command. So with this technology, with this software, we were able to show that the astronauts can perform complex medical procedures, and the astronaut performing this for us in this image is not a physician, is not ultrasound trained. But by the end of the procedure, they were getting images that were as good as images that we might get on the ground when we have a trained ultrasonographer doing them. So this kind of procedure support is possible in spaceflight and can be used and designed to assist the astronauts to perform these complex tasks when they don't have their ground to talk to. Another thing that we are working on and hoping to be able to create, at least from a high-level perspective, is a vision for onboard clinical decision support. And so what does this mean? It means, how can I help the astronauts to make good medical decisions when they may have incomplete information or they may not be able to talk to the ground? And so from a medical perspective, this is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people believe that AI is going to be in the future. It's going to be, you plug a bunch of information into a computer and it spits out a diagnosis and tells you what to do. The reality, though, of what we have right now on the ground is very, very simple and very, I'm going to say, basic analysis or very algorithmic. So if I order a CAT scan of someone's head because they've had a head injury, I get a pop-up on my computer that asks me why I'm ordering it, what the indication is, and then it tells me whether it believes it's the right test to do or not. That's a very simple form of clinical decision support, but that is the most that we use normally on the ground on any given day. What we're trying to do from a spaceflight perspective is develop something that's much more robust, something that can access all of the data on the astronauts, on the vehicle, on their environment, can aggregate all of that data, and then perform not only a basic analysis of it, but much more complex analysis of that data, and then help the astronauts by giving them a possibility of 3 different diagnoses, for example, or here's a number of treatment options that you can consider that will help the astronauts to make those decisions, but won't make the decisions for them. And so this clinical decision support, in essence, is going to be a decision model that the astronauts have to be able to access on board. They need all of their health and medical data on board for this system to be able to analyze that information and give them usable information. And they then have to be able to demonstrate that they can use it effectively and make good medical decisions. And so what our team is doing right now is developing a concept of operations for this capability and high-level requirements that we hope to build towards in the future from a clinical decision support perspective. The last area I'm going to talk about is the novel use of onboard resources. And the reason that this is important is because anyone who knows about designing a spacecraft knows that mass and volume are king. So everything needs to be as small as possible. Everything needs to be as light as possible. Everything needs to fit into the smallest possible space. And in order to increase our capabilities as we go further away, while simultaneously decreasing our footprint from a medical system perspective, we need to find ways to optimize resources. And so the example that I'll give you here is this device, the IV-Gen device. And this is something that our team worked on a number of years ago as a prototype. And what it is essentially it takes drinking water from space station, it sterilizes that water, it puts a bunch of salt in it, and it makes intravenous fluid. Right now, we fly bags of IV fluid to space. And many times, we don't use it. And when they expire, we have to fly more bags of IV fluid to space. And when we calculate out how many bags of fluid we might need for a mission to Mars that's 2 or 3 years in length, and we have to take into account the fact that every one of those bags is going to expire potentially before we need to use it, that number becomes insurmountable. You suddenly have half of your mass of your medical system is just bags of fluid. And so instead, the question then becomes, there's already water on board. Why don't I just use the water that's on board to make IV fluids? And we recycle almost all of the water that we use in space. So we can add it back into the system. We're not taking the astronauts' drinking water away. But ultimately, we can make IV fluid when we need it, if we need it. And so IV-Gen flew to station a number of years ago and was successfully demonstrated as a technology. And we are now taking that technology and miniaturizing it as much as we can. And then hopefully we want to integrate that technology into the environmental control and life support system of the vehicle. So that somebody could essentially toggle a switch, start making IV fluid, hook an IV up or a line to that device, and it will start pumping it into the astronaut who needs it. And so this is an idea or a concept where we try and look at every available resource on board and see how we can best use those resources to minimize our footprint from a medical perspective. However, the caveat to this is that if we just look at the medical system in isolation, then we forget about all of the other things that affect the health and performance of the astronauts. And so ultimately, we want to design the best possible medical system, but it has to be integrated with other vehicle systems. And so a crew health and performance system that takes care of the astronauts in every manner is something that we are ultimately trying to build towards, because that is what will allow them to take care of themselves and stay safe and healthy and productive during a Mars mission. So we not only ultimately have to think about the medical risk, we have to think about all of the human health and performance risks, and then we have to think about how all of our stuff interacts with all of the other vehicle stuff. And so the example I'll give you here is, you see power on there, you see communications as well, data. The vehicle is constantly transmitting data. If you imagine it as a pipeline, most of the time that pipeline is just full of vehicle data. At some point, we need to be able to take over that data stream if we need to for a medical emergency. If we are not planning how to decrease the bandwidth of all of our data needs or to improve the ability for us to transmit and use medical data, we're going to end up wasting part of that data stream. And again, nothing can be wasted. We have to be as efficient as possible in everything that we're doing. So our integration with the vehicle as itself is integral to the success of all of these different systems. Someday, I seriously hope that we are going to get to a vision where we're going to have this kind of sick bay on a spacecraft. We are a long way away from that, but I believe that a number of the capabilities and technologies that I've shown you here tonight are the first steps that we're going to take towards that kind of vision where people can take care of themselves in spaceflight and be on their own and be successful in what they're doing. And so that is the vision that we are working towards. So with that, I will summarize here for you that the Human Research Program, and particularly Exploration Medical Capability, is trying to develop these autonomous capabilities for medical needs, for our missions to the moon, so we can train and prepare for Mars. But in order to do that, we need to do a lot of steps along the way. We need to show that this stuff can work on the ground. We need to show that we can design all the protocols and procedures so they can actually use the stuff we send into space. And then we need to demonstrate that we can use it in increasingly complex environments. And ultimately, there's no more complex environment than spaceflight. So the International Space Station or the Artemis missions are the ideal place for us to demonstrate all of these capabilities and technologies. And then, if we're successful, we will integrate all of that into a medical system design that will be part of the Artemis vehicles and then part of the vehicle to Mars. And so with that, I will end here and happily take any questions that you may have.
So if we can quote Star Trek again, please. Fascinating. Well, that's the wrong accent for the wrong officer on Star Trek. So with people online, I want to ask a question from online, Mark, and then I'll come to you. Roxanne's been asking a bunch of questions, but this one she put in early. So this is Roxanne Fournier. How is HemoQ different / similar to the CSA's bioanalyzer?
So that's a great question. I appreciate it. The types of analytes that the HemoQ can do are similar to some of the capabilities of the CSA's bioanalyzer. For those of you who don't know, the Canadian Space Agency has developed an in situ lab analysis technology, which they call bioanalyzer, and they have flown it to space station and tested it on space station. They have similar capabilities, HemoQ and the bioanalyzer. Our purpose in doing HemoQ was to try and show that we could take a commercially off-the-shelf device with minimal modification and make it available for spaceflight, whereas bioanalyzer was designed specifically to function in space for that purpose. So this was a demonstration using commercially available technology, and we wanted to try and get it up there as quickly as we could to see how it functioned.
And I should apologize. Normally I try and open the mic for the speakers, but I think I run the risk of shutting everything down at the moment, so I'm not going to do that. So we'll try and bounce between questions in the room and questions online. There's a bunch of questions online, so if you want to ask a question, get your hand up. Mark, use your hand up.
So can you talk a little bit about the integrated medical model, what you like about it, and what does it need to improve, and what would be the future of something like that?
So the integrated medical model, for those of you who don't know, is it's referred to at NASA as IMM. IMM is a probabilistic risk assessment tool. And what IMM does for us is it essentially runs in a computer simulation. It runs thousands and thousands of missions. You can tell it how long you want the mission to be, how many people you want to be on it, and it will run thousands of missions and give you the average output of those missions in terms of the number of medical conditions that have occurred or the resources used to treat those conditions. IMM was designed specifically for use with the space station, with the International Space Station, so it is baselined to low Earth orbit. And it has, when compared to real world data, been validated and shown to be pretty accurate in terms of some of its predictions for spaceflight. But it's not accurate necessarily for every condition or for every capability that you would want to fly. So one of the things that we've been doing in XMC is we are working on a new tool that we are hoping to have ready in approximately a year, and it's called Impact. And it is a trade space analysis tool. So it is a combination of a probabilistic risk assessment tool, like IMM, but we've expanded the functionality to allow us to perform a trade space analysis. I am a physician, not an engineer, so when I showed up at NASA and they were saying trade space analysis, I had no idea what they meant. So I'll give you an example. If you ask a physician if they want to take a defibrillator to Mars, they will all say, yes, absolutely, I want a defibrillator because you never know, something bad might happen. But then if you say, you have to choose between a defibrillator and an ultrasound machine because I can't fit both. That's a trade space. And so what we are trying to do is we're trying to use advanced computing tools to help us not only predict which conditions might occur on an exploration mission to the moon or ultimately to Mars, but we want to be able to actually compare, should I take this or should I take that? And so we're using some very complicated math that I frankly do not understand as a physician. But the goal is to try and solve a problem, which in mathematics is called the backpack problem. And it's an optimization problem. You can only take so much stuff. How do you choose the best stuff to take that reduces your risk the most? And so Impact, when it comes online, I hope will be used for exploration missions, not only to help us try and predict which conditions might occur, but also to help us with our system design challenges for the medical system, where we can actually create System A versus System B, and we can run them through the simulations to see which one is more optimal in terms of its outcomes and its risk buy down. So the IMM effort was necessary for the work that we're doing now on Impact, but we're trying to evolve to this new trade space analysis arena that will hopefully be baseline to the exploration environment, but also allow for that much more complex trade space analysis.
So we have a lot of great questions coming in from online, so let me go to one and then I'll come to the audience here. Let's see, where, in all caps, from William, what about radiation issues?
Yes. What about radiation issues? There is an entire group in the human research program called the Space Radiation Element. And their job is to study and help prepare for the radiation that we are going to experience in deep space and try and mitigate the effects of that radiation on the astronauts in mission, but also try and protect them in terms of their long-term health. We actually know a fair bit now about the deep space radiation environment from a number of different studies and spacecraft that have flown over the years. What we really don't know is the interaction between the radiation and biology. And so we have only flown a handful of people. So technically we've flown 24 people out into deep space. 12 of those people walked on the moon. All of those people were men, so we know nothing about women in the deep space environment. And the period of time that they were out there was on the order of days. And we're now talking about sending people to Mars on the order of months, if not years. So another big part of the Artemis missions, frankly, is to not only better understand the deep space radiation environment, but also to study the effects of that radiation environment on our astronauts. And to see over time, as we send people to the Gateway spacecraft and we leave them in lunar orbit for 6 months, they're going to be in deep space, exposed to that deep space radiation for way longer than anyone has ever been before. And so ultimately, what we have to do is we have to understand the deep space environment, its impacts on biology, and then figure out all the right steps needed to mitigate those effects. So there's an entire research group at NASA dedicated to that topic.
We're actually also working on a space radiation lab concept here at RISE, which is everything from predicting the radiation through sensing, mitigation, and then ultimately the biological impact. But it's a huge challenge and covers a lot of different things. Wade, I think you had a question, did you?
Yeah, I think you partially answered it, but I'll do this slightly different angle, this radiation. For the non-medical community, that's been the long pole in this tent for a really long time, the mitigation things. Real shielding, water, there's been a variety of different Is the bigger risk in that the solar flare storm kinds of things, or just the highly energetic background radiation? Which of those two tends to be the bigger problem for long haul?
So I am not a radiation specialist, so I will give you my interpretation. As of right now, humanity can pretty well predict solar events before they occur, and we can make plans in general to deal with those. And we have places on the space station that are more shielded than others, so we can anticipate when it's going to happen, see it happen in advance, and have our astronauts move to a safer area. From my perspective, the solar particle events are a concern, but the number of solar particle events that have been big enough in the past to cause a really significant immediate health concern are actually very, very low. However, the galactic cosmic radiation, that background stuff that's all around us, that's basically pelting you every second of every day in deep space, and there's absolutely no way to shield against it. Those particles are so heavy and so fast and so much energy that they just go right through our shielding. So from a medical perspective, what a lot of the work that the Space Radiation Group is doing, from my perspective, is that they're very much looking at I don't think I can stop galactic cosmic radiation from impacting people, so I want to know what it's going to do, and I want to lessen the effects that it has. And so here we're looking at nutrition or nutraceuticals as solutions. We're looking at different pharmaceuticals that are used on the ground for radiation therapy that might be able to help the tissues of the astronauts kind of preserve themselves against those exposures over a long period of time. But then ultimately, we also have to, quite frankly, and a report came out from the National Academies about this not too long ago, we have to accept that astronauts will be exposed to higher than what we would like them to be doses of radiation on these missions. And we have to be able to inform the astronauts of the risk and have them understand that risk and be willing to accept that risk before they go. I can tell you that there was a study that we commissioned in the Human Research Program a few years ago from a science and technology prediction or prognostication group that was looking at how we deal with cancer today, trying to imagine when a mission to Mars might happen 10 or 20 years from now, and then imagine what the long-term effects are going to be on those astronauts when they come back from Mars. And for better or worse, I can tell you that the good news is that by that point in time, which is a number of decades from now, this group believed that the capability to make cancer a chronic illness, as opposed to something that is going to kill you, is increasing every day. And they believe that many forms of cancer will be highly treatable decades from now using a bunch of novel technologies. And so in the end, what we may end up with are astronauts who accept the risk, who come home and develop a cancer or some long-term event or sequelae from their exposure, but we have effective means of treating them for it. And so that may be part of the way that we get past the radiation as a showstopper for a Mars mission.
If I can go on line again, can you discuss, this is from Ramon, who's an MD as well as an MBA, can you discuss any planning related to psychiatric emergencies?
That's a great question, I appreciate it. In the integrated medical model that we talked about before, and in the impact trade space analysis tool that we are building right now, we have a number of psychiatric conditions that are part of that model, as well as the capabilities necessary to treat them and the resources necessary to treat them. So we know that it's a possibility. We have to anticipate and plan for it. But ultimately, the hope is, the goal is, that the astronaut corps is an extremely highly screened population. And they are chosen specifically for their ability to overcome challenges and deal with hardships. And so the first step is in the selection of our astronauts. The second step is in the giving them all of the tools that they need to stay mentally and healthy in terms of their psyche. And so the way we do that on space station is they can basically pick up the phone and talk to people on the ground. Like if you want to call your loved one, they can just pick up a phone and call them and, oh, look, it's the space station, and you can just talk to them on your cell phone. So we have a lot of different things that we use right now to try and help the astronauts to cope with the isolation and confinement of space, as well as the extreme environment of space. But for a mission to Mars, for example, clearly that kind of real-time communication is not going to be possible. So some of the things that the astronauts themselves even talk about are, stop me from being bored. If I'm bored, my mind is going to race. I need stuff to do on the way to Mars. And so here, a simple example is food. The astronauts really like mealtime on space station. They are now growing vegetables in space, and they actually really enjoy taking care of those vegetables in space. If we think about their psyche in a holistic way, and we give them movies to watch and books to read and music to listen to, and we try and send them videos and sort of remote care packages or electronic care packages from home where they get to talk to interesting people or do interesting things, or we give them plants that they can take care of and then they can prepare all their own food. If we help them to stay functional and to stay busy, that's one of the ways that we can try and deal with the psychological impacts of an exploration mission. But ultimately, from a medical perspective, we are considering a number of psychiatric conditions and the way to treat those psychiatric conditions as part of our system design.
So I don't want anybody stealing this idea, but just give me we could actually develop a series of online courses where they could actually get degrees or certificates while they're traveling to Mars. Okay. I'm just thinking of homework. Yeah, you had your hand up, please, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about analyzers, blood chemistry analyzers, and medical procedures, and ultrasound sort of covers a lot of imaging. What about where do they go to the drugstore? You can't really send a CVS or is there any thought to organic chemistry lab and biological monoclonal antibodies or whatever, in case there are autoimmune diseases or cancer? How do you store thousands of different potential antiarrhythmics or anti-cancer drugs if you didn't bring them along?
So what you're describing is essentially in-space manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. And it's interesting because right now on the space station, a number of the different studies that are going on in space station are directly related to making pharmaceuticals in space. Can we make something that's more pure in space than we could on the ground because of the lack of gravity? The challenge that we have from a medical perspective in giving them usable medication is right now there is a device on the ground that makes an FDA-approved medication. It makes one medicine, and it's the size of a refrigerator. So the world in which we would be able to chemically put together a medicine on demand for an astronaut is a wonderful idea, but it's still very much science fiction, at least in terms of the ability to get it small enough to get it on a spacecraft. So we do have some work ongoing with some universities around the country that are looking at that type of onboard manufacturing for pharmaceuticals, but that is part of our, I'll say, our long-term planning. The other thing that we have to consider, though, is the possibility of 3D printing medicines, which is somewhat similar to the onboard manufacturing, but might use a slightly different process. And that is an area that we've looked at 3D printing some very small medical devices or very small things like splints or things like that for injuries that people have. But from a medication perspective, it's a goal of the 3D printing community to try and get to that day when they could actually 3D print medicines, but it's also very much far, far in the future.
So if I can go back online, this is from one of the students in the Space Studies program who happens to be from Canada, Leah. And I think you touched on this in your talk, but I'll ask the question, will NASA send a doctor along with the crew when they go to Mars, or are you relying on the kind of things that you've talked about tonight?
So NASA has a number of standards that we follow with respect to health and medical planning and preparation for missions. And the NASA standard, as it is currently written, does say that a mission to Mars should have a physician as part of it. However, we're actually in the process of revising that standard, and that discussion is ongoing as to whether or not there needs to be a physician on board. And so how we're trying to frame the problem now is, what are the capabilities that we need? What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to enable those capabilities? And is a physician the only person who can do those things? Or are those all trainable, or can we make software packages and other technologies that will assist people who are non-physicians to do those roles? So as a physician, I obviously, again, would love to see a physician on the way to Mars. But what we really have to think about is, what is the right composition of the crew? What are the right skills and abilities that they need to have? And if one of those people is not a doctor because we can help them to do all of their medical tasks using technology, then so be it. It's whatever is most important to the success of the mission. But as it stands right now, if we were going tomorrow, there would be a doctor on board.
So we've come a long way since Dr. DeBakey and the impact of space medicine, what we've discovered on the International Space Station that's helped improve conditions medically here on Earth. So I'm very fascinated by what's going on right now. You just had the KRIS 23. You have research on bioengineering of tissue, stem cell research. Give me a little bit more regenerative medicine on what we're learning, how rapidly we're learning, the impact that this will have on astronauts in long-term travel. But I'm very interested in what we're learning that's impacting Earth right now.
So the examples that I'll give you are ones that I am most familiar with, and they're related to the work of my group, the Exploration Medical Capability. One of the things that we are trying to do right now is we are trying to share all of the information that we have learned in spaceflight with respect to medical system design and all of the work of our engineers and doctors in medical system and thinking about all the conditions that are going to occur. And we're trying to share that information with commercial companies. And so one of the things that's happening is there's a number of different groups here on the ground who are trying to design new technologies or new capabilities that we are looking at in spaceflight. And the example I'll give you here is the clinical decision support work that our team is doing right now. That is an area that is extremely hot on the ground from a medical technology perspective. There's a lot of different companies and groups out there trying to figure out how to crack that nut, so to speak, or how to solve that problem. And what we hope to do from a NASA perspective is we hope to share everything that we are learning in that area with anyone who's interested on the ground, so they can see how we're looking to design it for spaceflight, and they can then use our ideas and our models to build what they need on the ground to take care of people here. So,
and that's open even regardless if it's being done only on the ISS right now.
So this work is not specific to the ISS, but what we are trying to do is NASA can't play favorites. So what we want to do is we want to share it as broadly as we can. So we're actually looking to publish much of our work in this area so we can share it with the external community and find people to partner with for NASA's needs, but also to share what NASA has learned with the ground so that people can then take that and expand upon it for their own uses.
So I know you gave us plenty of time for questions, so I think we've got time for a few more, just a couple more anyway. So I'm going to read, this is a long question, but I think I have to read it all because I don't know enough to be able to break it down. It's from a registered nurse in Canada, Adam. There are very few nursing technologies, for example, remote monitoring, but some great progress. My interest is in symptom measurement and PROs, maybe you'll tell us what that a PRO is, which I believe would be valuable in augmenting the value of simple assays. Is there any work on symptom measurement using AI that you've heard of with these technologies?
Patient-reported outcomes.
Ah, thank you.
Say that again?
Patient-reported outcomes.
Reported outcomes.
I did not know that acronym either.
I'm feeling, yeah, I'm not feeling very well. I got it. Thank you.
So the answer I'm going to give you, I'm afraid, is not quite to the question that you're asking, but it's aligned. And what you're talking about is the ability to monitor patients in the least invasive way possible and watch for trends of how their health may be decreasing and then acting upon that. So I don't have it on me right now, but I normally wear a Fitbit, and it tells me what my heart rate is, and it tells me what my resting heart rate is, and it tells me how I'm sleeping. And I don't know what to do with any of that. It doesn't tell me what to do. It just gives me a bunch of information. And so I think in some ways what the question is asking is, it's great to get more information or more data on the patient or on the astronaut in this case, but how do we know what to do with that information? And so one of the areas that we have invested in at NASA is looking at, in medicine we have lots of invasive monitoring, so we can stick a catheter into you somewhere and measure pressure inside a vessel, for example. We have lots of ways of non-invasive measuring, which is an example of that is the Fitbit that I wear on any given day. But one of the ways that technology is increasing is we now have ways of not even touching someone, but being able to figure out what their vital signs are. And so these remote sensing or non-wearable technologies is an area where we have been investing some of our time and resources. And the idea in some of these technologies is that you could have a camera system and maybe even a small, almost like a radar system in a room, and a person can be sitting across the room, and I can tell you what their pulse and their respiratory rate is just by looking at their face in the video. And so this kind of analysis is something that we are particularly interested in from a vehicle perspective, because if I'm gonna have a camera on board anyway to see what the astronauts are doing, and oh, by the way, that camera can tell me real time what their pulse is on every astronaut as they float through that module, that is information that I could then potentially use. But then the next step, of course, is figuring out how do I look at the heart rate variability in that person? How do I measure their resting heart rate or maybe their heart rate when they're exercising? And how do I take that information and then predict that they are getting sick before they actually get sick, and then act upon it? So it is an area of interest, but it is still very much, it doesn't exist on the ground in many cases, but it is something that we are having some early investments in from a NASA perspective.
If you don't mind me adding to that a little bit, we have a scalable health lab here at Rice where they're doing some of these camera systems to look at these vital signs. And the other thing as part of the conversation we've been having is it's a way of thinking about it as an early fault detection, but now it's not just a machine, it's a human. And for some of these habitat ideas, the habitats, unlike the space station, are not going to be continuously crewed. They're going to be intermittently empty, and the system still has to work. And so you need an intelligent system that doesn't kill the astronaut when they show up. Unfortunately, the proposal we put in, we called it HAL, and HAL wasn't good for astronauts. So it's supposed to be the Habitat Autonomy Lab. It sounded really good, but obviously that didn't work. But this is a lot of discussion that's going on along that front as well. And again, because I think I'll be interested in your comments on this maybe later once we've got some other questions, but you mentioned it, it's the whole integrated system. You might be working on one tool here and one tool there, but at some point they all have to work together and be efficient in the whole thing. And that includes the system as a whole and the people as a whole, the astronaut, the crew. So I think there was a question at the back up here, and then I'll go and then come back. So, sir.
Okay. Well, first, thanks for this. This really was fascinating. My question's about blood. So you mentioned IV fluid, and maybe this is something that just doesn't make its way into the backpack, as you said earlier, but what do you do about blood transfusions? I imagine volume is a challenge, but also just like the shelf life. So what's your group thinking about in terms of blood?
We think about blood transfusions every day in the hospital. And primarily we use them for people that have chronic illnesses. And in many cases, our astronauts, especially the ones going to Mars, are unlikely to have any significant chronic illnesses. But one thing we do have to consider both on the lunar surface and on Mars is the possibility of trauma. And the possible need for blood in a traumatic situation. And so we published a paper a few years ago from our group looking at the possibility of using the walking blood bank concept, where the idea would be that you would select a crew who have compatible blood types with each other, so you could actually swap blood between crew members. There are possibilities now for some blood products to be essentially freeze-dried and then reconstituted and used. Those are something that we also will be considering as part of our trade space analysis. But you're right, the likelihood and consequence of a condition related to the need for blood products, if it's not high enough on the list, it's probably not going to fit in the backpack. And so ultimately, if the backpack gets bigger over time, as our vehicles get bigger and more capable that are going into space, then we may be able to include capabilities we wouldn't have had otherwise. But the walking blood bank concept is something that our team has done some research on.
So I think I'm going to do maybe 2, maybe 3 more questions. So I'll go here and then I'll come to you, sir. I think there's another hand up in here. So this is from David online. David Morse. Have real medical emergencies in Antarctica been helpful to figuring out the issues?
Yes, so it's a great question. And one of the things that we are actually using right now for our development of our trade space analysis tool, Impact, is we are collecting as much real-world data as we can on medical events in extreme environments. And so Antarctica is a great example. There's all kinds of extreme environments where people have a number of medical ailments. You think about people climbing mountains, people on scuba diving expeditions, people in the wilderness. And so we're looking at all of the published data that we can find on these difficult environments, all of the conditions that have occurred in those environments, and then we're trying to scope that by making sure we're looking at people who look like astronauts. So if the person in Antarctica was 65, we don't have a plan right now to send a 65-year-old to Mars. And so we would exclude that person or that data from our database. But for any condition that might occur in a person who is astronaut-like, we are trying to capture as much of that data as possible so that we can accurately predict the conditions that may occur on an exploration mission. So that the use of analog environmental data is very important.
So have you done a trade study on which crew member to eat first?
I don't know if we're allowed to do that trade study.
Yes, sir. Okay, so you've discussed quite a bit about diagnostics and about medicine or treatment with medicines, and just sort of had to segue to trauma and blood products. But surgery, is that being considered? We're going to have to teach the astronauts how to potentially fix appendicitis or some other surgical complication that can come up in very healthy people.
Yeah, it's a frequent question that we get, and it's a fascinating topic. I think part of the challenge is that when people say surgery, they see an operating room. And given our mass and volume constraints on the spacecraft, I would love to see an operating room someday in space, but it's hard to imagine right now. We're being asked to fit stuff into like a bag. So thinking of an operating room is fairly robust from a medical capability. So what I tend to do when we're talking about this is I tend to refocus it on invasive procedures. Are there different ways that we can do invasive procedures if we need to during a mission? And the answer to that is yes. So the example I'll give you brought up appendicitis. That's a great example. Before a physician goes to Antarctica with the Australian program, if they still have their appendix, they have to get it removed because they don't want someone having to do their own appendectomy in Antarctica. We actually did a study looking at this, the trade-offs between what if we prophylactically could remove every astronaut's appendix before they go to Mars? And what we found was that the complications or risks associated with the surgery were not a good trade-off against that prophylactic surgery for a condition that may not occur. And so ultimately, the question then becomes, if appendicitis does happen, when I think about surgery on the ground, you think about opening somebody up or using a laparoscope to look inside and find the appendix and take it out. That requires a fair amount of equipment, a sterile field, and a lot of training. Whereas some studies have shown, especially in Europe, that you can treat appendicitis pretty effectively with antibiotics. And if it doesn't work just with the antibiotics alone and a small collection of pus forms and abscess inside their belly, I can find that with an ultrasound, and I can stick a needle in it with a tube, and I can drain that infection out of there. So we're thinking about complex medical procedures or invasive procedures from a spaceflight perspective, but we typically don't talk about surgery because when we do, people envision an operating room, and that's simply not a realistic possibility.
Is there another question in the room here? Okay,
Yes, oh,
last one here, yeah.
What happens if someone dies?
Huh. I always get asked this question. My favorite question. No one has ever died in space, so that's good. We do have a plan for what to do if someone were to die on the space station. And we, frankly, have to have a plan for what to do if someone dies on the moon or on the Artemis missions or on the way to Mars. We haven't figured out exactly what that plan is right now. I can tell you that a number of years ago, there was a proposed Mars mission where they wouldn't be able to open a hatch until they came home. And so then you can imagine someone dying in a spacecraft and you couldn't do anything about it. So we talk a lot about hermetically sealed bags and the breakdown of a body over time and all those sorts of things. But ultimately, when we're thinking about the moon and we're thinking about Mars, we not only have to think about what to do with the body from a health perspective, we have to think about what to do with the body from a psychological perspective or from a spiritual perspective. And then we have to think about protecting the place that we're going. So we don't want to contaminate Mars with a bunch of biological material so that when we are trying to look for signs of life on Mars, we can't figure out if it's something we brought or something that was actually there. So from a planetary protection perspective, people really don't like the idea of us burying people on the moon or on Mars. So there's a lot of considerations that go into it. There is a plan on space station. We have to plan for it for the future, but as of right now, that plan is still in work.
So I think it's very obvious that there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions, and I mean, I haven't even asked half the ones I would like to ask. So I really appreciate it. It's a fascinating subject, and particularly for us here in Houston because of the focus on human spaceflight. But I think what you get the sense of is it's not just one problem. It's not, we sometimes characterize how do you keep an astronaut alive or something, but it's actually many, many different things that have to come in and be integrated. And I think the work that KRIS and his colleagues are doing is right there at making all this happen. And ultimately, it won't just be a benefit for astronauts going to Mars, it'll be a benefit for us here on the ground because as these technologies get better and smaller and more efficient, we're all going to benefit from that. So I think it's really, really, really excellent work, and I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us. So please join me in thanking. And like I say, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So hopefully we'll see you November 11.